So, some interesting developments recently in Istanbul. So I made a video a few months ago because I went to Istanbul in November. And interestingly, in January, just the previous month, they instituted some new policies at the Hagia Sophia where the building is now has a two-tiered system where Muslim worshippers are the only ones allowed on the main floor, whereas if you're a tourist, if you're not Muslim, you have to go onto the upper floor, which is basically just it's not really, it's kind of like galleries that encircle the main floor where you can look at it from above. Now, I'm not 100% sure how it works because I've seen some sources claim that you have to be a Turkish citizen to be on the main floor, whereas others claim you have to be a Muslim. I don't know which is accurate. Like if you were Muslim and not Turkish, would you be allowed on the main floor or not? I'm not sure about that. I'm also not sure how do they verify if a person is Muslim or not? Like how do you prove that or disprove it? Like do they make you like recite the Quran? Like I don't even know if somebody just claimed to be Muslim and lied about it. How would they enforce it? Same thing for like across the Muslim world, frankly. Like, but yeah, regardless, apparently they have this policy now, and I got very lucky because I went there in November, which was just 2 months before they started to enforce this policy. I mean, personally, I think it would be best if you were able to go on both the main floor and the galleries to get the full experience. But if it was just one or the other, I definitely think going on the main floor is where you get the best views and where you get to see things the most close up. Like especially off to like the areas off to the sides of the building, like you can't really see those as well from up in the galleries. Of course, there's stuff in the galleries you can't see from the main floor either. So it's like again, if it's one or the other, it would be better to do both. But I mean, I think personally, I think on the main floor is where you really are able to get the best views of the entire building. Now, that said, also they're instituting now, on top of forcing the non-Muslim tourists to basically what I call now the cut galleries, because it's basically what you are at this point. You're in the cut galleries while the Muslims are on the main floor. Uh, you also have to pay a ton of money to get in. Like it's now like the equivalent of like $50 or something like that in Turkish lira. So it's expensive. It's very expensive. I've never heard of that much being charged to go into a religious building as a tourist. Um, like some churches do charge admission in Europe, but I've never heard of it being that expensive. Like it is sometimes that expensive for like palaces or mansions, but I don't think I've ever paid that much to go inside a church or any religious building as far as I can remember. Although I could be wrong, maybe there was like one or two, but I for the life of me can't remember any specific ones that are that expensive. So yeah, it's become very kind of hostile toward tourists in that sense and toward non-Muslims as a whole. But also, like, frankly, I mean, I see this as part of two bigger trends that are happening. Firstly, the trend toward greater Islamism in Turkey under Erdogan. This is the most radical thing yet. And not only that, but people are not complaining about it. Like when the Hagia Sophia was initially converted into a mosque, a lot of Christians and a lot of secularists complained about it. They made a pretty some pretty loud complaints. But this is actually far more radical because when it was converted to a mosque in 2020, anyone could still walk on the main floor of the Hagia Sophia. There was no segregation between Muslims and non-Muslims in terms of what part of the building you're allowed to access. The only segregation was during the services, there was like only men were allowed in certain parts of it, and even if you're non-Muslim. Like I was able to walk in those parts of the Hagia Sophia during the service as a non-Muslim. Nobody asked if I was Muslim. It was only because I was male. But the sorry, wait. I'm not male. I'm female, right? Because of the whole draft thing. But if anybody saw that video, you'd understand what I'm talking about. But yes, uh, But yeah, my point is, yeah, as a guy, I was able to walk into the main part of the mosque, um, like the part where the worship service was happening, because and other tourists were there too. So it wasn't really like very strict at the time I was there. It was only the women, uh, the people who look like women. I don't know what they would do with like non-binaries and transgenders and what have you in this day and age. Like, I mean, but basically, if you look like a man, they let you in the main part of the mosque during their service even. So it was pretty lenient in terms of like people's access to the different parts of the building up until now. And now they've made it a lot stricter, but I'm not hearing many complaints from the same people who complained back in 2020. It's kind of like, I guess it's a bit like the frog in the pot of the boiling water. It's like they just implement more and more restrictions over time, and people, I guess, complain less and less over time. And that's what has me worried, is that in Turkey, are they going to go in the direction of a lot of Muslim countries and simply ban non-Muslims from mosques altogether? I mean, that would hurt their tourism industry quite a bit, and tourism is important for Turkey. So, I mean, they'd be very stupid from an economic standpoint to do that. They'd be shooting themselves in the foot, because the mosques are frankly one of the main tourist attractions there, and it would be pretty dumb for them to do that, at least if money is their goal. If they want to make money, maybe they don't want to make money, maybe Islamism is their only goal. I mean, I don't know. But that leads me into my second point, which is that it's part of another wider trend, which is just the global trend of kind of like fuck you tourists. That's kind of a trend I'm noticing everywhere these days, is that tourists are increasingly just unwanted and kind of blamed for like every problem in the world. Like they're blamed for climate change, which is kind of accurate, but there's a lot of other people who also contribute to climate change that aren't getting as much shit, like suburbanites, SUV drivers, pickup truck drivers, people in the third world who have like six children, and like all these factors, like all these groups, I think aren't blamed nearly as much. At least Taylor Swift is getting some of the blame, which frankly she deserves. But yeah, I mean, overall, not just for climate change, but in general, I find tourists are just getting blamed for everything these days. Like they're blamed for like the loss of culture in certain places, and it's like, okay, but immigrants are a far bigger contributing factor to the loss of culture, and we're not allowed to talk about that. And furthermore, a lot of tourists actually want culture to be preserved, in the sense like they want to go to a place and still see the traditional architecture and not just modernist crap everywhere. Whereas like a country like Germany, that's rich enough that they don't need tourists, they're rich enough they can build ugly buildings everywhere and it doesn't matter, because they have the money anyway. So I mean, whereas a country like say Italy or Portugal or Spain that's a bit poorer has more incentive to preserve its architecture for the sake of tourism. Like again, I'm not saying tourism is the only reason they preserve their architecture, but I think it's part of the reason. So like whether tourism does destroy local cultures or actually helps preserve them, I mean, I think there's it's a debate. Like I think there's arguments for both sides. Whereas with immigration, I would say it's almost 100% like destroys local culture rather than helps to preserve it. Um so yeah, I mean, but my point is, I do think that there's just a lot more restrictions on tourists lately everywhere. It kind of started in 2020 with the big global event that happened in that year. But a lot of the restrictions that were implemented then, ostensibly because of the big event, have not been repealed since, or have been just slightly modified. Like, for instance, a lot of the national parks imposing these entry reservation policies, limiting the total number of guests and making you reserve these very limited tickets that often sell out within minutes on their website. Like at some of the parks, they sell out within minutes, like Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, Glacier National Park in Montana. Those ones they can sell out in minutes. But yeah, I mean, this is just a general thing I'm noticing. More and more places that were previously easily accessible to tourists are now becoming less accessible or not accessible at all. And I think it's just a global trend right now, and it's going to continue, and it's probably going to continue getting worse. And that's why I keep telling people, if you want to travel somewhere, it's probably better not to wait if it's somewhere you really want to go. Because if you wait for your retirement or you wait 10 years or whatever, there's not necessarily the chance you'll get to go there. Or if you do, it won't necessarily be as good an experience because it'll be a heavily reduced experience in terms of, what you're allowed to do or the quality of the experience or whatever. This is just a trend I'm noticing everywhere, and not just the Hagia Sophia, but again, as I mentioned, national parks in the United States and Canada. I'm sure there's many other examples across the world. It's just those are the most obvious ones that stick out to me right now. So yeah, I mean, a lot of things going on here for sure, but yeah, interesting development. And I think one thing that really underscores the whole anti-tourism movement is the graffiti that you often see in Europe where it says tourists go home, refugees welcome. I think it really shows the double standard where it's like they think that tourists are destroying their local culture, but refugees and immigrants aren't. Even though it's like, I mean, are tourists the ones who are altering the demographic makeup? I mean, I guess occasionally a tourist will knock up a local woman and impregnate her and she'll have the baby, but very seldom. I mean, maybe in Southeast Asia that happens a lot with like male sex tourists. And to be fair, I don't defend that shit. I mean, they should crack down on that shit harder in Southeast Asia. That's completely within their right. But yeah, I mean, by and large, I would say immigration, including refugees, does a lot more to change a country's culture than tourism does, even though I agree, both do to an extent. But I think with tourism, it's more complicated because some of the effects are positive, some are negative. Whereas with immigration and refugees, it's like, it's just overwhelmingly a negative impact. So, yeah.